let's talk about thrusts. More specifically, I want to talk about defending against thrusts, some mistakes that I've been making, and some ways I've found to deal with them. For everyone's amusement, while I talk, here's a bunch of footage of me getting stabbed in the face repeatedly. I'm mostly going to focus on this kind of heavy committed thrust that you see in these clips, because I think that's the most interesting and the hardest one to deal with, although I'll talk about some other kinds of thrust at the end. So what's going wrong? Well, really there's two things. First of all, I'm doing the wrong action, and second of all, I'm at the wrong distance to try and defend against these attacks. My sword action here is a relatively small lateral motion, still pretty close to the body. In short, I'm trying to parry the thrust. Particularly for a heavy committed thrust like this, simply isn't going to generate enough force to displace it. But when you also factor in that I'm often too close, it means that by the time I'm trying to move the thrust away, it's too late. So let's fix it. Look at these thrusts, which are both from the gold medal match at Wessex Bristol 2024. These two exchanges are nearly identical, except for a couple of small details that mean that one goes my way and one I get stabbed in the chest. And really the main first difference is that I've adopted a low guard rather than a middle guard, which gives me a greater range of motion in order to be able to deflect the thrust. I'm also just a little bit further away when I step into measure, and I use a smaller step in my approach, which gives me the time I need to react properly to the thrust coming in. Using this larger motion to deflect the thrust absolutely corresponds with Vadi's advice for how to deal with thrusts, where he basically tells you that the way to defeat a thrust is to cut into it with any cut that you want. I've been also doing quite a bit of Dalagokia's sidesword recently, and he describes both a rising cut from underneath deflecting a thrust, and also a descending cut coming down on top deflecting a thrust, and both of these work very nicely. Let's look more closely at those distinctions. The rising version is pretty straightforward. Essentially you just do a rising cut directly into the sword as it's coming in. If you are familiar with the rising beat defense against the downward cut, it's exactly the same. Perfectly easy to do from either side, although I would probably only do it from a low guard. The descending version that most people will be familiar with is essentially the breaking thrust from Fury. This presupposes you're in a high guard, and as the thrust comes in, you essentially cut downwards directly into it. It absolutely works, there's nothing inherently wrong with it, apart from the fact you need to be in a high guard for it to work. A slightly more versatile version is something I've stolen, or adapted rather, from Dalagokia, which is this half cut on top of the sword, which you can do from any guard. Rather than doing a full cut where you're kind of cutting through, you're still cutting kind of towards the middle position, but it is a defined striking action. This version works perfectly nicely from low guards, and even works from a middle guard. And as a general rule, I tend to prefer to come up underneath high thrusts and come down on top of low thrusts, but there are many thrusts where either work perfectly fine. The observant amongst you will have noticed that I'm stepping back in pretty much all of the exchanges that I've just showed, and I think the footwork is quite important. Where exactly you step will depend a little bit on your opponent and how committed they are to the thrust, but for these really deeply committed thrusts you want to step back to give yourself a bit more distance in order to deal with the problem. Stepping out can also work nicely, especially if they're not quite as committed with their thrust. In a lot of cases, gaining just a bit more distance can also mean that less optimal action with the sword still succeeds. But at the same time, sometimes crazy shit just happens and it works for no particular reason, like when I parry with the shield here. Not recommended to try that at home. So nice and simple. In short, to deal with these committed thrusts, cut into the sword that's coming at you and step back or step away from the sword in some way, shape or form. The problem is that this is only one kind of thrust, and actually there are lots of other kinds of thrusts where that same advice is terrible. First example of this is relatively light thrusts, which are trying to probe you to either get you to move, generally by kind of targeting shallow targets, and trying to provoke a reaction from you to make too large a motion. Doing an overly large cut in these circumstances creates an opening for them to do a real strike, or moves your hands in a position that you're not necessarily able to defend against these kind of shallow thrusts coming in. Obviously, retreating massively will keep you safe, but you won't have any opportunity for coming back in and striking the opponent. Similarly, for people throwing one-handed thrusts at the edge of measure, a large cutting action into that is complete overkill, and any kind of stepping back reduces your ability to capitalize on the opportunity created by them taking their hand off their sword and losing the ability to control it. So you really want to be moving forward rather than backwards with these, and you do not need a large motion in order to deflect them, because if you've got two hands on your sword, you have significantly more power and control over the blade. You also get some thrusts which start off as cuts and get converted to thrusts. For these, I would treat them as cuts in terms of your defense and try and interrupt the cutting action. Once you've done that, then the thrust isn't on point and you've essentially defeated the thrust already. It certainly doesn't require the same level of force to displace the thrust, and it is a bit more forgiving in terms of the footwork and distance management. Which brings me to the last kind of thrust I want to talk about, which is the thrust in opposition, my favourite thrust, essentially thrusting directly into a point as it's presented to you. And this one again, I don't think you're going to be able to get a very large range of motion to push the blade aside. What I certainly don't recommend doing is just dropping your sword and trying to stab. That's not going to go very well for anybody. But here the so-called exchange of thrust or counter thrusting in is normally the high percentage move. Obviously picking the right thrust defense requires you to have read the opponent appropriately, and therein lies the challenge. Sometimes doing one thing will work brilliantly and sometimes it will work terribly depending on what the opponent has done. And there's no real substitution for learning how to do that apart from fencing lots of people and trying things out. Last thing I'll say is that the problems people face with thrusts are exacerbated heavily by stepping into the opponent's measure without being prepared for the strike coming in. You can use thrust in opposition or even the half cutting motion that we've seen to defend against the thrust into a presented point to try and close safely. But you need to be careful because any kind of wide motion as you're stepping in is going to be an opportunity to potentially be struck. So it is obviously challenging to approach someone who is waiting to stab you in the face. So in summary, most light thrusts are easy to deal with. Just block them and try and close and make use of the opportunity from having to defend against it. If someone's coming in with heavy committed thrusts, you probably need to step backwards to create some room or step outwards to create some room, and you probably need to defend against it using a strike into the sword rather than merely trying to displace it with a parry. Once you've done those things, you should be fine and able to hit them at your leisure. Thanks for watching, and hopefully some of you get stabbed less than you used to. And the observant ones amongst you will have noticed that I waited until after the last leg of the Wessex League to publish this video. Enjoy.